And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, the Spring Fling special, or episode 61 for the regulars. So, essentially, so this podcast, everything you wanted to know about photography, but we're too afraid to ask. Every week, for those of you who are new here, I do a podcast where you can ask questions, submit photos, and I'll teach you the ins and outs and tips and tricks of photography and anything you want to know, really. So tonight is the Spring Fling special. So Spring Fling, for those of you who don't know what that is an event that happens each year in this corner of southwest Scotland. Usually the final weekend in May. Anywhere between 60 and 100 artists open their studios to the public, and you get to go around and tour the studios, talk to the artists, see the makers at work, buy directly from them, ask them all the questions you would love to ask an artist, but without being separated by a shop or a storefront. You actually get to meet and talk to them in person. Now, whilst this happens each year, of course, as from last year, COVID has meant serious restrictions. Last year's was online, this year's is also online as well. So essentially, if you go to spring-fling.co.uk, there you can find the online version of Spring Fling happening all this week. So it includes you can visit sort of online studio pages of, I think there's over 60 different artists and makers. There's workshops, live videos, recorded videos, plenty to keep you busy and occupied, and really interesting stuff to find out. Now, as part of my contribution to Spring Fling, as well as the fact that you can find my page on spring-fling.co.uk, we also have the fact that I've decided to turn this podcast over specifically to making it a Spring Fling related podcast. So I thought for a while what would do that, and then one of the things that really occurred to me was the fact that during Spring Fling, the live event, I have a studio space, and for 2 or 3 days, or for 3 days over the weekend, I have people come to the studio, I do demonstrations, they can look at examples of my work, but they ask me questions. People ask me questions all the time, absolutely anything and everything, most of them photography related, some of them absolutely nothing to do with photography, but it doesn't really matter because I still enjoy the blether. It is one of the things I really love about Spring Fling is the chance to meet and chat with all sorts of different people that I've never met before, some of them have been following my work for a long time, some of them have just found me in the brochure and just sort of turned up to see what was going on, some have sort of stumbled in by mistake, didn't even realise there was a studio, saw a signpost and wondered what was that, but it's always fascinating and interesting. So what I thought I would do for tonight's podcast is the idea that you can ask me the questions. Now, I put up an event page on Facebook earlier, just at the end of last week and over the weekend. I've kind of put out little reminders, also on Instagram, and also to my mailing list to say to people, post me some of your questions, so I would get to know a few questions in advance. Now I've had about half a dozen people send me some questions, but most of them, to be honest, have sent me more than one question, though some of them also overlap. But there's also the opportunity here where you can ask me live. This is a live podcast, and so talking about the fact that this is live, comment. Leave me a comment. Let me know you're here. Let me know where you're from. If this is your first time here, particularly, I'd love to know where in the world people are tuning in from. So, if you want, type into the comments any questions that you have, and we'll kind of see how it goes. But first of all, just let me know you're here. So I can see there's a couple of comments in already. My wife's happily greeted everyone with a good evening. Brian from Dumfries says, good evening all on a lovely sunny night in Dumfries. Jackie from South Africa is saying, hello there everybody. Kazia is saying, hello everyone. Sandra is saying, hello everyone from a sunny Birmingham. Pat is saying, good evening all from Somerset. Usual panic of getting lost. Yeah, there was a last moment message I got from Pat wondering where to find me on Facebook. And Becca from Norfolk says evening all. Okay, and Stacey from Pennsylvania is coming to say hello as well. So, right. where are we at? So I've told you what Spring Fling is, and I've told you this evening that we're going to be asking questions. So if you've not already sent me in some questions, feel free to ask as we go. But I have several questions scribbled down onto a separate text document. So this is the idea with this is, if you had the chance to visit me live in my studio, what would you want to ask? It's basically as simple as that. And the questions that I've already got are quite varied. So maybe you just want to sort of sit back and listen, see if I already answer the question. They asked the very question you wanted answered. If you're thinking, well, maybe he's not going to answer that, then type it into the comments. Let me know what you would like to know. So all about you, all about me, but whatever you want to know. So with that in mind, right, okay. So let's start with a question. I mean, although I've had questions from, like I said, about half a dozen, or actually quite kind of more different people. Some of them have been overlapping. So what I will do is I'll kind of run through. I think I'll start probably just on a very simple thing. I had a couple of people asking me the most basic of technical things, as in, what camera do I use? What lenses do I use? And what's my favourite ones for that? So I know not everybody who tunes in is a complete camera geek. I know some of the people who tune in really are. So just to let you know, I use a Canon, and I use a Canon 7D Mark II which is this. And then the main lens, my workhorse lens as such, the one that's on there 99% or 90% of the time anyway, is a 24 to 70 millimeter f2.8 lens, and it's a nice one, and it does most of what I need to do. It doesn't do everything I need to do, but it does do most of it. And I started off with, previous to that I had a Canon 7D. This is a 7D Mark II. I'm looking to upgrade. It will be another Canon camera, basically because once you start into a system, whether it's Canon or Nikon or Sony or Panasonic or any of these, you buy the body, but then you buy the lenses. And then as you start building up your collection of lenses, the lenses are worth far more than the body, the camera body. So when you upgrade your camera body, if you change to a different system, or a different make, then suddenly you would have to update all your lenses as well. So kind of once you're in Canon, you're always in Canon. Once you're in Nikon, you're always in Nikon, unless you have loads of money to spare and you're quite happy to sort of leap from Nikon to Sony to Panasonic. Most of us don't have that kind of spare cash though, especially if you're trying to make a living as a photographer. So Canon's where I'm at the moment. I'm not totally sure. I'm currently looking at, there's a new mirrorless system which Canon has, the Canon R5. I think Robert from Texas already has one of those, and I've been getting a little bit of camera envy with that. That's possibly a way I might go. Lenses, other lenses I have, the 24 to 70 is a good kind of mid-range lens set. So it goes from almost kind of wide angle through to a bit of zoom. And given the fact that most of what I do is portraiture, it's a kind of good range. I also have my zoom lens, which is a 70 to 200. Now that allows me to zoom in much closer. Not so good for portraits, although it creates a nice bokeh, and creates quite a nice picture. The problem is with the zoom lens, to get that picture, I have to stand quite a distance away. Now, I suppose I've used it a few more times since COVID, where you have to keep a minimum of 2 meter distance. But by and large, I've found I kind of end up standing so far away that I'm yelling slightly. And with portraiture is all about the connection you're making with people. And if you're too distant and you're not making that connection, it makes it harder to get to the place where you want to be. I'll probably talk a bit more about that in a little while. Other lenses I then have a wide angle lens, which is a 10 to 22. That's really lovely and wide. It takes in a lot of space into a single picture. Then I have what's known as the Nifty 50, which is a prime lens, a little 50mm lens. It's actually the cheapest lens you can buy, less than £100. But it goes to f1.8 and it creates a beautiful bokeh. Bokeh being the quality of the blur of what goes out of focus. So you can have a wide aperture, gives you a narrow depth of focus, so the eyes will be in focus, but it's gone out of focus by the time you get to the ears. The background becomes beautifully blurry, and it kind of really isolates the subject. I also have my most recent acquisition, which I got just before Christmas, was a macro lens, which is the Canon 100mm fixed prime lens macro lens, and that allows you to get in really close. So some people who've been following my work might have noticed I've started doing a lot more in the way of close-up bits of daffodils and flowers and bits and pieces from around the garden, and the macro lens is what's kind of allowing me to get in close with that. So that's the equipment that I have, but the main thing is I've got a Canon 7D Mark II, and it's the 24-70 is my kind of key lens. Okay. Looks like there's a couple more comments. All right, Stacey's come in. Sorry, not Stacey. Sandra's come in and said, I'm quite interested in creating my own pastel textures to use with my flower photography. And I was wondering if you have any suggestions I could use to create texture and any thought on lighting to bring out the detail. Okay, so texture, quite often what you can do to make pictures look a little bit more interesting is you can create textured overlays, where essentially you take a separate photo of some texture and then lay it over the top of the photo in various ways, or mask it into the background, or there's various things you can do with that. And for that though, really what you want to do is essentially build up a library of textures. And in essence, the best way to do that is just go out and look. It depends what kind of textures you want. Old brick walls, bits of concrete, bits of paving, wooden slats, pebbles, sand, anything that has texture, photograph it, but photograph it as flat on as you can. And then to bring out the texture, what you really need is lighting coming from the side. If you think about the fact that what you're talking about in texture is an uneven surface, if the light is all coming from the front, you know, if you've got the sun behind you while you're shooting the texture, there's nowhere for the shadows to fall, so the shadows seem to disappear and the depth of the texture seems to disappear. Whereas if the light is coming from the side, then that way you get all the pits and troughs and the shadows stand out much more. So the real thing to remember about texture is what you're really looking for is side lighting. And if you can get the lighting from the side, then you're going to get the best kind of textures. Once you can do that, build up a texture library. Have a folder on your computer dedicated to sticking textures in. And then when you come to playing with your camera and your images, and you want to sort of, then you can pluck one out, stick it into into Photoshop or whatever other editing program you've got, play around with the different blending modes, play around with masking so that it only appears in certain places, not in others, and then you'll probably find that you've got lots to play with. So I hope that one helps, Sandra. Right, okay, let's what else have we got? April sent me one saying, what's my favourite landscape photo? That was an odd one to do, because actually landscapes aren't my speciality, but they are one of these things which pretty much everybody takes a photo of because you're out somewhere and you have your camera with you, and it's a good place to start with landscapes. If you can get out of the house, gardens, if you are in the house, you tend to do much more kind of close-ups. Sorry, if you've got a garden, landscapes. If you're out, you can take a shot of a big space. Now, but it's not my speciality as such. Most of my landscapes tend to be taken from within 10 meters or wherever I've parked the car, to be honest. So it's an odd one, really. And the idea of trying to create a favorite, I think certainly the ones that are most emotionally charged for me, the ones where I had the most fun, was a few years ago, it's over 4 years ago now, coming up to 5. I went to Morocco, and part of being in Morocco, I did a stint where we went into the Sahara Desert, stayed overnight camping in the Sahara Desert, and we're there at the sunrise. And what I will do here, I'll just pull up this photo, and I'll go to that and flip over to here. And essentially I've got a wide angle lens on the camera, and I managed to, as the sun rose above the sand dunes, I managed to get a lovely texture kind of coming in. And then you can also see camels silhouetted against the rising sun as well. And for me, this was, I love seeing this photo and a couple of others from this set, because it reminds me of the incredible experience that I had. In Britain, I think probably one of my favourites is, let me sort of try and find the right folder again. Yeah, in fact, actually, is this one. And this is Castlerigg Stone Circle in Cumbria, in northern England. And we went there. It was a wet the day. It was moody, dramatic. It had stopped raining just at this point, but you could see from the puddles, that the ground was sodden. You see all the dramatic sky in the background and the fantastic textures on the stones as well. And basically what I did with this, I've got the wide angle lens on the camera, but I did 3 shots to get in the whole stone circle. I wasn't able to fit it all in one go without standing so far back that everything became tiny. So I stood closer, took 3 photos overlapping, and then in Photoshop I stitched them together and then played with the editing to bring out more texture in the clouds and that sort of sense of drama with it. And for me, this is a kind of fun landscape photo. I think this is probably the one that I'm most pleased with. So hope that one answers your question, April. Right, okay, let's close that. So what other questions have we got here? Oh, this was a fun one. Also from Sandra, in fact, who said, how long had you actually been doing photography when you realised, actually I'm getting quite good at this? And were there any milestones along the way? Now, I suppose with this is kind of one of those where I started doing photography. If you go back 15 years, my photography was nothing special at all. I mean, there are some photographers out there who, could talk about their first box brownie when they were 6 years old and how they've been involved in photography ever since. I haven't. I mean, we had a camera, I took photos of the family, but there was nothing in it. It was only after I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome round about sort of 14, 15 years ago. And basically this means that I have a much more limited amount of energy. Now, whilst these podcasts I come across as bright and energetic, in order to be able to do that, I have to take it really easy for the couple of days before, and I will be really very tired for the couple of days afterwards. But in the early days, I didn't know what was going on. I just felt tired all the time. I had no diagnosis. And then the notion of chronic fatigue came up. And the problem is with chronic fatigue, or ME, is that there is no known cure for it. It's one of these things whereby you're just told, okay, you've got tiredness, it might go away, it might not. You could be like this forever, it could get worse. Nobody knows. And then you're just kind of left with it, and somehow you have to deal with that. And it was around this time that I then started getting into photography. Up until this point, my photos were, I would have dodgy horizons, I might have my finger hanging over the corner of the lens, I'd be taking photos of people and a bit of their head would be cut off, or the person, the wall behind the person would be a nice sharp focus, but the person themselves would be out of focus. All the same standard things that happen with anybody who's got a camera but doesn't really know how to use it. But I found at this point in my life where I suddenly felt a whole chunk of my life had been taken out with my control. So the camera suddenly became this little corner of my life which gave me a sense of control. I could adjust the aperture, I could adjust the shutter speed, I could adjust the ISO, I could play with the angles, I could play with the lighting. There's all these different things I could do, and each of which would change the outcome of the image. And then if I took that image and put it onto the computer and played with it in Photoshop, I could edit it and change it again. So essentially, it gave me this area of control which became extraordinarily important to me. And because it was important, I kept at it. And because I kept at it, I got better at it. It's interesting, some of the conversations I've had with many of the regulars of this podcast. So you have conversations offline. There's quite a few people who sort of started later in life, quite often following traumatic events, whether it's a death, a divorce, an illness, or other things, whereby again there's been that sort of sense of control, where photography is just one of these things where you can really get into. So it can be very technical, and you can bury yourself in the technicals, but it can also be very creative and artistic as well. And that creativity, and it takes you away from being stuck in your own head with all your fears and worries and stresses and everything else going around in your head. And there's an awful lot of people I know for whom photography is essentially the saviour of their mental health. And even more so, there's been people discovering it during lockdown as well. They may not be able to get out and do landscapes, but they can do stuff indoors, they can do stuff in the garden, they can photograph other family members. So I kind of came at photography like that. Then overlapping, there's other questions here which, like for example, why portraiture? Why did I get into portraiture? And I think to begin with, I started off like, so again, it's that kind of, once I kind of got into photography, I was doing sort of the stuff that an awful lot of people do. It's so, you might sort of rusty, talk about texture here, Sandra. I mean, there's the notion of, the rusty door handle, the peeling paintwork, that kind of thing. Sunsets, you try to see a sunset over a loch, you just sort of keep clicking away and clicking away. It all seems absolutely wonderful. And the sort of the lonely tree sitting on its own in a field, away from things, in this case a couple of sheep sitting underneath it. These were the things that were grabbing my attention. And I did this for, a year, couple of years, and then I kind of discovered faces. And suddenly portraiture found its way. I think there was something about faces. It was so much goes on in this tiny space, this space that's really not much larger than the size of your hand, and yet we have all these muscles, all these expressions, all these amazing different ways that a single face can look. And then if you add in lighting, you can change the way you can change expressions, you can change angles, you can do you could take 1,000 photos of a face and none of them would be the same, even though it's the same face. And I found I started getting into moody black and white photos. And one of the questions was there a kind of milestone point where things changed for me? And absolutely, the big one where everything changed for me was this photo of my friend Mark. Now, Mark is a poet, warm, friendly, lovely guy, laughs at my jokes, makes me feel, it makes me feel good about being me. And I started off, I've been playing around and sort of been seeing some ideas, I'm discovering the notion of side lighting. And so I had him by the window and we just got the light coming in from the left-hand side, hitting his face. And then I took this back into Photoshop and started editing, and I darkened down the shadows and I increased the texture, and I played around with this for a couple of hours until I ended up with this photo. And I remember looking at this photo, and this is the first time I'd ever done anything like this, and it felt light years ahead of anything else I'd ever done. I just remember sort of gobsmacked at this photo, thinking, wow, I did this. This is just so unlike anything else I've done. And that feeling was electric. That feeling of taking a photo beyond what I thought I was capable of doing was a real rush. It was a buzz. It was an excitement. It was an adrenaline rush. And in a way, that's kind of what I've been chasing ever since. Ever since I took this photo, I've been chasing that idea of trying to create photos beyond what I thought I was capable of. And to begin with, I did this periodically, it's happened more frequently. Of course, as I've got better with photography, that's got harder to do because the bar keeps getting higher. I get better at my photography. It's then harder to do something which is going to impress me beyond what I can do. What this also did was this photo really cemented my notion of portraits. The idea that faces were really where I wanted to go, this sort of fascination. And, with this photo, here we have Mark looking like some kind of psychopath coming out of the shadows. And yet, like I say, he's nothing like that in real life. You meet him, he's warm, friendly, lovely guy. Not this dark, shadowy figure. And that, again, really brought home to me this notion of photography as a storytelling format. Photography isn't necessarily about truth. There's one of these, one of the biggest lies about photography is that the camera never lies. Absolute nonsense. The camera never tells the truth. The camera is incapable of telling the truth. You can't, first of all, when you take a photo of someone, you're taking them from one light source, from one angle, with one expression. That's not a truth. That's a snapshot. That's a single instant. When we meet people, it's like if I freeze the screen at any moment here, you'll have a rough likeness of me, but you wouldn't say any frozen moment is necessarily representative of me, because my mouth could be frozen at a funny angle. I could be half blinking. And these things aren't necessarily how you tend to think of what I look like. So really, when we experience people, the other thing is, it's not just a case of the photo is 2 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions. It's 2 dimensions instead of 4, because we experience people through time. And as such, a photo is never going to represent a full person, in the same way that a single note is never going to represent a piece of music. Any note only makes sense if you know what note came before it, what note came after it, and what notes are running alongside it. But a single note isn't going to tell you anything about that piece of music. And a single photo doesn't really tell you that much about the person. It only gives you a moment. And the thing is, that moment can be manipulated to create a story. And that photo of Mark, to me, was a prime example of how an image it creates a story. The viewer starts trying to fill in the shadows, fill in the gaps, trying to build a story. Who is this person? Are they a danger to me? Are they a threat? Are they interesting? What's going on here? And the moment you have the viewer starting to sort of fill in the gaps and sort of work out what's going on, you have story, you have narrative. And that's exciting. And so if you stop thinking of photography as some kind of representational medium and instead think of it as a storytelling medium, now we can tell whatever story we like. And you can do that with faces. You've only got to think what actors do, or whether it's actors on stage or in the theatre, or whether it's in cinema or television. People are playing roles. We buy into the story of a person on the screen. And photography allows us to do that as well. And so for me, portraiture kind of started moving down that way. Then there's another thing, which is I love interacting with people. I love chatting with people. I'm very much a people person. And whilst I can appreciate a good landscape photo and I can appreciate a good wildlife photo, the problem is with these other genres is they don't talk back to me. They don't interact with me in the same way. And I love that interaction. I love the idea of collaboration with the person that I'm photographing. That they're involved and together we're making a story that neither of us would necessarily have done on our own. So that notion then of where was the turning point for me, it was that photo of Mark was the turning point for me in so many ways. it sort of showed me what could be done with a camera, what could be done with photography and storytelling. And it's not exaggerating to say it changed the entire direction of where I was going at that point, and has influenced pretty much all the photography I've done since. So I hope that answers that question. So let me just close that. Okay, a couple of other comments here. Oh, Peter says, nice photo of Castlereagh Stone Circle. Thanks, Peter. Stacey likes the black and white photo. Jackie says, great image of Mark. And Maggie says, still one of my favourites. And Becca likes that too. Sandra says, fantastic portrait. Brian is asking, what made you choose Canon equipment as your choice of work equipment? Well, yeah, it just came to a point. Up and before the Canon, I was using a bridge camera, and I was using a Fujifilm bridge camera, and I knew I wanted to go for a digital SLR. And then you're right. The thing is you've got this array of choices. Where do you go? And really, what happened was it was a friend of mine had got a 7D. And he was absolutely raving about it. He thought it was a fantastic camera, and so I plonked for that. I could at the time. I mean, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference. You know, there are people who say they are Canon people and Nikon people, or they swear by Sony. And what happens with each of them is maybe a new camera comes out, and for a little while they have a technical advantage, but then the other one brings out, another make will bring out another one which has a technical advantage, and then another one will bring out another which has a technical advantage. And the technology is so advanced these days that it's pretty much of a muchness. I think you grab one and you start, and then you work with it. There have been times when a new Nikon has come out and I've had a little bit of camera envy, and I've thought that's better than the one I've got, and it's better than anything that Canon has on the market at the moment. And then it swapped around the other way around. So really, Canon was a kind of a random choice. If I'd been talking to a friend who got a Nikon and was absolutely raving about that, I may well have gone down that way. So nothing more than that, I suppose, really, Brian. Okay, what else have we got? Stacey says, not everyone likes being photographed. I know you enjoy it, but are you interested in other genres? Other genres. Yeah, well, I suppose all photographers like going click. We like taking photos. But we get drawn to one kind of photography, generally speaking, more than another. We'll tend to find that there's one or two genres which really grab our attention. They're the stuff that we really love. Then there's a handful which we're okay with, we don't mind, it's all right. And then there's one or two that we tend to kind of steer clear of because we just find them too intimidating, or we feel so totally out of our comfort zone that we just don't know where to start. And that really varies from person to person. And I think a lot of it's to do with your experience, it's to do with your personality, it's also to do with the kind of feedback you get. I remember chatting away a few years ago to a guy who does these amazing macro shots of insects. So you get a super close-up head of a grasshopper or dragonfly or something like that, and they're amazing photos. And essentially what happened was I think he'd got a bridge camera which had a nice little macro lens version on it, and he managed to get this quite good photo of, I think it was a grasshopper, put it up on Facebook or whatever, and got a massive response to it. Everybody going on about how fantastic they thought it was. And the fact is, that's good for the ego. We like positive feedback. We try not to feel that we're completely influenced by, number of likes or what people might say, but we're human. And as humans, we have evolved to be a social animal, and however much we try, other people's opinions kind of find their way, they work their way into our subconscious. We can fight against that, we can reason against that, we can say, well, that person doesn't know what they're talking about anyway, so I don't have to take their opinion into consideration, and that's great, we can override that. But our default is, if somebody says that's lovely, we tend to feel a bit good, and if somebody says that's awful, we tend to feel a bit bad. And we're chasing the good feelings rather than the bad feelings. So I mean, again, I know when I started taking photos of, the peeling paintwork or the tulip or the crocus pushing up through the snow, things like that, and I started getting good feedback, and I started feeling good about it, and that kind of kept me going with it. When I got into the portraits, I started getting amazing feedback, and I realised that what I was doing wasn't like what anybody else in the area was doing either. I didn't feel like I was copying anybody else's local style, or there was, because faces are so different. If you and I could both take a photo of the same person, and we would have completely different photos, because how we interact with that person, what the choices we would make over lighting and expression, and what we wanted to get out of the photo would be different. Whereas 6 people can stand kind of on the same hilltop and take a photo of the same sunset over the same landscape. Got to be careful here, that sounds quite dismissive. It's not really meant like that, because good landscape photographers are absolutely amazing. But there is a certain level whereby stick 2 people with the same camera in front of the same vista and you will get more or less the same photo. Stick 2 people in front of a person and you will get 2 different photos. And so that's partly what I like about portraiture as well. So I'm aware that most photographers don't do portraiture, really. I think portrait photographers, we're kind of the weird end of the photography spectrum, because most genres don't involve people. If you're talking about still life, if you're talking about landscapes or wildlife, architectural photography, product photography, all these things don't really involve other people. And a lot of people I know who do photography also love photography precisely to get them away from other people. If you can go for a walk into the hills with your camera over your shoulder, you're away from everybody. And then it's just you and the camera, or you want to get in with the macro and photograph insects, or you want to, even street photography. Street photography I often think of as a bit like wildlife photography with people in it. Most street photography is taking photos of people. You're not interacting with the people, you're watching people in an environment, and what you're hoping to do is take a photo of an interesting juxtaposition of person and environment, or action and activity. And so you've got to have a lot of patience. You've got to be able to spot things almost just before they happen and be ready for it. I think good wildlife photographers will probably find they're quite reasonable street photographers as well, and vice versa. But it's not the same as portrait photography. You're not interacting with people in the same way. Street portraiture, that's a different thing. That is more like, it's a different kind of portraiture. But most forms of photography don't involve people. For me, portraits first. I'll take it, if I'm out there, I've got a landscape in front of me, I will take a photo of the landscape. During lockdown, where I haven't been able to take so many photos of people, in fact, actually, I suppose this comes on to one of the questions by VG, which was, given the limitations of COVID and the fact that I've not been able to go out and take a lot of portraits, how have I coped? And I must admit, I've been feeling it. I've been having the problems with not being able to get out. And I am a people photographer, I'm a people person, I love the interaction with people. Not being able to get out and photograph people very often, or only being able to do it a handful of times under outdoor conditions at socially distanced situations, I found very limiting and sometimes difficult to cope with. But at the same time, I can't not do anything with the camera unless I've got somebody in front of me. So the macro lens, I must admit, has been wonderful. Getting out there, getting into the garden, photographing, getting in close, doing little objects and plants and seeds and textures, and from an old penny to a bit of moss. That's been fun. Still life, another one we did a couple of months ago. Did a still life challenge. That was a lot of fun. So you still kind of want to do the photography. And of course, the other thing for me has been teaching photography, has been these podcasts. These podcasts have then become a way of me being able to communicate with, I mean, I know it's very one-sided. It's not quite the same as a Zoom call where you're able to talk back to me, but that's why I like your comments. Stick more questions in the comments, because then we do have at least some kind of interaction. So yeah, that notion of I've got the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group, and through that, people post images for critique, get the feedback, and there's this sense of community. There's this sense of working with other people, and that's been good for me as well. And those of you who keep coming back regularly, I hope it's good for you too. Hope I answered your question. Not sure whether I went off on too many tangents there. Right, okay. What other kind of questions have we got here? So another one here was with I think Jackie wanted to know essentially what the advantages and disadvantages of doing portraiture were. I've probably covered a certain amount of that, but yeah, I think it's down to that's really down to personality type again. If you are not a people person, that's not to say you're not a people person. That's too sweeping a statement. I think the biggest problem with portrait photography as such is you have to take into consideration the feelings of the person that you are photographing, which is different from street photography. Street photography, like I say, is like wildlife photography or documentary photography, fly on the wall style wedding photography. You're just observing what's going on. Portraiture, you are interacting with someone. And given the fact most people feel quite uncomfortable in front of the camera, unless you're a trained model, and most people aren't, or unless you have very little self-awareness, and again most people do, then most people feel uncomfortable in front of the camera. And as such, your job as a portrait photographer isn't just about working out your lighting and your camera settings and expressions and angles, although you need to be able to do all these things. But on top of all these things, you also have to be able to connect with them emotionally. You have to get to a point whereby they begin to trust you, relax with you, work with you, get excited by what you're doing, and get on board with it. I remember years ago, just shortly after I got into photography, I remember going along to an exhibition I saw with a landscape photographer, and he had these lovely, amazing landscapes about, and I was looking around, and I got chatting with the guy, and I said, do you ever do portraits? Because I'd just done that photo of Mark and was feeling quite excited about it. And his reaction was, oh, good God, no, that's all about egos. Couldn't do that. And I remember being quite shocked by that, but it was that understanding that actually it's really difficult. It's difficult under the best of circumstances to deal with somebody else's emotions and to deal with somebody else's discomfort. And then when you're doing a portrait shoot, you're in charge of a situation which is where they are inherently uncomfortable. So it takes a particular kind of personality that can do that. And now there are others. I mean, I remember watching some interview with American photographer Annie Leibovitz. And she talked about the fact that she never felt that you had to make anybody feel comfortable. She would just go ahead and photograph them, and it was up to them to express what they wanted to express. Having said that, she made her name photographing pop stars, rock stars, actors, musicians, people who are already performers. And I think there's a big difference as well. On the times when I've photographed an actor or a model, it's an entirely different beast. It's an entirely different thing to photograph somebody who's already relaxed in front of the camera. But for most of us, most people who turn up to get their portrait done or whatever photo I'm doing aren't used to being in front of the camera, feel hideously self-conscious, worry that I'm going to make them look ridiculous because they've had so many terrible photos of them before, and I have to build that trust. So if you're not the kind of person who feels that you could do that, don't go near portraiture. And it's no judgment on you. It's about understanding your personality. I mean, the flip side of it, I cannot do wildlife. And we've talked several times, joked around even on these podcasts about the fact that most of my wildlife photos are of the backs of animals just as they sort of disappear into the forest. I don't have the personality for wildlife photography, because for that you need patience. My God, you need patience. You need to be able to set yourself up. You need to be able to plan in advance. You need to know, where are the animals likely to be coming? When are they likely to be turning up? Where do I need to position myself in order not to frighten them away? And now I'll sit here for 3 hours or 2 days or 6 weeks until the right combination of animal and environment come together and I'm in the perfect place to take the photo. I do not have the patience. And that is my personality. My personality says, and it's the same thing with landscapes really, to get a really good landscape, not only do you have to trek out to, finding the right, climb up a hill and do all the physical stuff, you also have to have the patience. What happens if you turn up at the right place and the light isn't right? I remember chatting to a good friend of mine, landscape photographer Alan Wright, once, and he was met him in the town. Asking what he was up to, and he was going to be heading up to a local mountain where he was going to be camping up there overnight in order to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning to catch the sunrise across the Solway, hitting the Cumbrian hills, and it was to create a fantastic shot, and it was a fantastic shot. I saw what he created. But the idea of camping overnight on top of a hill to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning to take the photo, not me, mate. It's not me, it's not my style, it's not my personality, it's not what excites me. So I think different genres attract different personality types. And that's not to say you should always stick with it, because I think, there's a lot to be gained from going out with your comfort zone. But by and large, you tend to find landscape photographers have a particular kind of personality aspects to them. Similarly with wildlife photographers or street photographers or architectural photographers or underwater photographers or wedding photographers and portrait photographers. Not to say we're all the same, everybody is still different, but you will probably find that there are certain personality traits which are common within each kind of genre. So, hope that answers that one. Okay, what other questions have we got here? Actually, Fiji wanted to know about how you... no, it wasn't Fiji. It was somebody. Anyway, somebody asked me about how actually I do make people feel relaxed in front of cameras, especially given the fact that, most people are quite terrified of it. And I think the biggest thing here is it's about understanding the power relationship of the photographer and the person being photographed. This thing here, the person holding the camera has all the power. If I photograph you, I can make you look amazing, or I can make you look ridiculous. And we know this. So as soon as somebody pulls up a camera, how many times have we had ridiculous photos taken of us by people who didn't know what they were doing? They didn't really care what our feelings were about. They whipped out their phone, took a photo of us while we were half blinking and our mouth was at a funny angle and we looked terrible, or the flash was bouncing off the zit we had on the end of our nose, and a photo that we don't like of ourselves, they then thought was great, put it up on social media for 500 people to see, and internally we've just wanted to die of embarrassment. That feeling that our image, which we feel very protective of, has been taken by somebody else and exploited in a way that we didn't want. And this has happened so many times. As soon as the camera appears, we instinctively now feel, oh God, threat mode. So I'm going to tighten up, I'm going to put my arms across, I'm going to pull back, and I'm going to sort of glare, or, I've got to smile. So I'll smile with my mouth, and my eyes aren't smiling. And that look, which we've seen in so many photos, and it's such a defensive posture. And it's not a good look. Nobody looks good like that. But they maybe don't look as bad as they do if you get them with their eyes blinking and their mouth at a funny angle and a zit showing on their end of the nose without going and then it's shoved up on the internet. So this is the kind of problem. So because the photographer has the power, we feel disempowered. So an awful lot of my way of helping people, of relaxing people, is about re-empowering them or rebalancing that power shift. A lot of it comes through talking. When I turn up to a photo shoot, it's very often up to an hour goes past before the camera even gets taken out of the bag. I'm chatting to them, I'm relaxing them, letting them get to know me, I'm letting them get to know I'm not a threat, I'm letting them get to know I'm on their side. I've got various stories and anecdotes and things that I can talk about which allow people to start to relax a bit. And then one of the other very powerful tools, one of the most powerful things that I can do, especially if I'm doing an indoor shoot, I will tether my camera to a laptop or a tablet. So when I go click, they can instantly see what photo I've taken. Now, a lot of photographers will not do this. They will take the photos and they will only show you the edited versions afterwards, because they don't want to show you all the photos they get wrong. Okay? It's nobody gets a great photo with it. And it doesn't matter how long you've been doing photography, you will always take photos which are naff, which are no good. And so photographers are an insecure bunch like anybody else, and so they only want to show off their best work, so they very often won't show the client what's going on until they've got back, looked at all the photos, chosen the best ones, edited them up, and then they show the client. But what I discovered really early on was if I tether the camera to my tablet or laptop and take the photo and they can see it, they can get instant feedback. And to begin with, we have an immediate laugh. We go, oh, look, got you blinking. Oh, terrible. But it allows me to explore with them. And they go, oh. And I say, well, okay, tell me, what is it you don't? Oh, I've always hated my nose, or I don't like the squint, or that expression reminds me of my grandfather who I didn't get on well with, or whatever it is. And you talk, and talking and the looking and the taking more photos. And slowly they start to get used to what's going on the tablet, on the screen. And essentially, I start teaching them how the camera is interacting with their face. And then this starts to become more empowering because they can see. I can say, well, look what happens if you lean forward a bit. Look what happens if you tilt your head a bit. Look what happens if you glare into the camera. Look what happens if you look away from the camera. Look what happens if I move this light around here so the shadows fall in a different way. And it takes the myth and the unknowingness about it, and it starts to make it a bit more real. It starts to make it, right, now I see what's going on. And then they start to relax. And there comes a point, and it varies. For some people, you might be 20 photos. For some people, it might be 150 photos. But there comes a point with everybody where sooner or later, something in the back of their mind goes click. They start to relax. They no longer feel threatened. They realise I'm on their side, and they relax into it. And when they do that, pretty much almost every photo I take, apart from if they happen to be blinking, works. And then they come out of it, not just ending up with a great photo, but feeling better about themselves, feeling empowered. I've now trained them in front of the camera, so for the rest of their lives, as soon as somebody brings the camera up and points it at them, they know what to do in order to make themselves look better rather than looking like a rabbit in the headlights. So that sense of empowering people, I think, is probably the most powerful thing I can do as a photographer, both in terms of relaxing them, making them feel better about themselves, and ending up ultimately, because of that, getting the best photo out of them. So there you go. That is absolute gold. You won't hear any other photographers telling you that stuff. Maggie said, would you camp out if it meant you could photograph someone really interesting? That's a brilliant question. Yes, I suppose. I'd never thought about that. Yes, no, you're right. I wouldn't camp out under difficult conditions in order to get a beautiful sunrise, in order to get a lovely landscape. But if I had the chance, if camping out meant that I had the chance to then photograph somebody I would really love to photograph, and I could interact with them in the way that I wanted to, then yes, I would. I would go the distance. And I suppose that then ties back in with that notion of genre photography and what you're most interested in and what you're going to be best at. Is how far are you prepared to go to get the photo you want? Are you prepared to trek for several days into the hills, camp on top of mountains under horrific conditions for several nights in order to get the sunrise you wanted? I'm not. That landscape photographer is. That landscape photographer will always end up with better photos than me of landscapes. Whereas, for me, a lot of people have asked, sometimes some of the narrative photos I go to where I've ended up creating a team of people, and I've had to book things in advance, well in advance, and we've had all sorts of complications to overcome to create amazing photos. And they go, God, I would never have the patience to do that. I would never be able to work with other people. I would never be able to put a team together. I would never be able to do that amount of planning, and then the amount of editing you did and all this kind of stuff. And it's because their interest isn't as strong as my interest in it. And that's the key. That's the bit that makes all the difference, is if you find that it's triggering that passion, that excitement within you, you will go to whatever degree you need to. You will sit in a hide for 6 hours, 2 days, or 6 weeks, or whatever, in order to get that photo of the osprey grabbing the fish out of the water, or the snow leopard up in the Himalayas or something. Because that's or you will go out into the street and you will photograph complete strangers. You will go back again and again to do it. You will push yourself out of embarrassment comfort zones or whatever to get the photo you want. Oh, Maggie's followed that one up with, and who would that be? Who would I want to photograph? Who would I camp out to photograph? I think really my ideal subject, if I could photograph anybody, who would I really make a big effort to go and photograph if I thought I could? It would be probably performers. It would be some kind of actor, musician, rock star, but an aging one. I don't want the young and the youth. I want the face that's lived in. I want somebody so really we're talking about someone like Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, or we're talking about actor Dame Maggie Smith, or even Judi Dench. An older actor, certainly over 60, ideally over 70. One who has the life lived and the incredible textures and face, but is also a performer who's not going to be frightened of looking into the camera, who I could interact with, and we could play and create characters and scenarios, and I could play with the lighting, and then I think that I would be in absolute heaven to be able to take photos like that. So older actors or musicians are really where it's at for me, I think. So yeah, great question, thank you. Okay, what else have we got here? Oh, there was a yes, this was an interesting one. That VG said was, with difficult clients, have you ever felt like giving up and walking away? How do you deal with difficult clients? For example, if a client wants a photograph in some style that you feel is not going to compliment, but they're adamant about it, would you still take it? It is, after all, your brand value as well. How do you deal with such situations? That's a brilliant question. I love that one, VG. So, what happens if I know a particular kind of photo would work best for the client? The client wants a particular photo which I just think is going to be naff, isn't going to do them any favours, isn't the right kind of photo that they want. But they're quite insistent that they want this particular photo to be this way. Now, the key with this is actually coming back to collaboration and the connection I have with the person. Now, there's no doubt if you're talking about a client, the client is usually paying. Therefore, you are there to take a photo that the client wants first and foremost. But VG's right. My brand is attached to this. If this photo is going to go out and they're going to say, hey, I had this photo taken by Kim Ayres, and I think it's a terrible photo, it's not the kind of photo I would like to be associated with, then that could mess me up quite badly. The reality is it doesn't ever really come to that. And it doesn't come to that because if I'm going to be photographing a client, one of the first things I do is I meet up with them. Now, for the last year and a bit, that's been meeting via Zoom. I've nearly always done this, but before Zoom, I would meet people for a coffee or hot chocolate and just start discussing. And I would always want to meet up with people. There's only been a handful of occasions where I've not been able to do that, but I would that's really tends to be if somebody's turning up to the area and wants the photo taken. I've not had a chance to meet them in advance, but even then I will tend to have quite a long conversation with them on the phone beforehand. Because sometimes, again, with portraiture, because it's about the relationship you have with the person in front of you, sometimes warning flags go up. You just realise, and you discover this the hard way, obviously, because you had occasions like this, that some people you're just not going to connect with. Either there's something about them that winds you up so much that you can't get beyond it, or something about you winds them up so much that they can't get beyond it. There are things out with your control. The best example I can come up with this is I remember meeting somebody once who, even though I'd not met them before, and even though everybody had told me what a fantastic, lovely person they were off with me. There was like an immediate wall up. There was an immediate kind of distance. There was a suspicion. And I couldn't figure it out. I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I remember really doing a lot of soul searching afterwards, running it over in my head, thinking, what had I said something? Had I done something? Whatever it was. And I couldn't figure out what I'd done wrong. And chatting to other people who were there at the time, they didn't see anything. They didn't notice anything. But I knew there was a problem with this person. I discovered much later on that this person had then confided to a mutual friend. The problem was I looked like somebody who they'd known at school who they didn't get on with. I can't remember if it was a bully or a teacher or somebody they'd had a bad relationship with. And they couldn't get past that. The moment they saw me, all they could see was the person who'd upset them in the past. And sometimes you just can't get past that. There's going to be something physical about you somebody else is not going to connect to. Or maybe it's the sound of your voice. Or maybe they just don't like your beard. Who could possibly not like the beard? But and at that point, if the connection isn't going to happen, the relationship isn't going to happen, the photo isn't going to happen. You're not going to be able, and so quite often at that point, after you learn from experience that sometimes you have to have these meetings first, because if I'm going to create the best photo of the person in front of me, they need to be able to know that they can trust me. And if they don't feel that, we're never going to get the decent photo. And there have been occasions whereby essentially we've walked away. It's been left with a nice little open, well, we'll chat about this in the future at some point when we both know that we're never going to get back in contact again. It doesn't happen very often, but on occasion it does. The next thing, though, I suppose occasionally that happens, you slip through, sometimes people have got a very specific idea of what they think they want. And I know that they would work better another way, but they feel too insecure to be able to trust at that point. And so what I usually do at that point is take the photo that they think they want. But it's built into, in a warm and friendly connecting way, let's try both of these out. Allow me to take the photo this way, and so they know they're getting the photo that they want, and that's okay. And with the idea that, and if they want that photo, that's fine, that's not a problem. But while we're here, let me just move these lights around, just indulge me a bit, tilt your head this way, do whatever else you're going to do, and let's try this photo out. And 9 times out of 10, probably 95 times out of 100 or more, they've ended up preferring the photo that I took as well. So the point is it's not about being confrontational. You use everything you can not to be. It's not about they want this photo, I don't want them to have that photo, head off against each other and the strongest person wins, because in that situation nobody wins. You have to bring people on board. You have to make sure that people feel that they have been heard, they are being respected, that you're collaborating together to get the best result that you want. And when you approach in that manner, you avoid virtually all those kind of problems. There is also the other thing that sometimes I'm out there taking, to go back to that brand thing, I mean, there are photos where I'm asked to do, and it's bread and butter photo income. It's photos which are not super fantastic portraits. It's not super fantastic narrative photos. Sometimes it's take a photo of these croissants, or whatever it is, because they just need a photo of those croissants. It's not going to be award-winning photo. It's not going to be interesting, challenging photo. But I know enough about photography to be able to take some interesting, better photos of croissants than they could do. The thing is, with that point, is they're not going to necessarily be out there boasting about the fact, hey, my croissants were photographed by Kim Ayres. And nor am I going to be putting those photos on my portfolio. Those photos won't be going on my Instagram and social media feed. They won't be going onto my website as prime examples of the kind of photography I do. The stuff that I put up on, the stuff that I promote, has to be the stuff that I feel proud enough to, that it's got my name on it, and that's what's affecting my brand. So I take a lot more photos than the ones I promote. I only promote the stuff which is the stuff that I'm super pleased with. So that I hope that kind of answers really. So yeah, I am careful about the brand, but I'm also very, very careful about the relationship that I have with people, so that kind of confrontation never really happens. Okay, so Brian's put up another comment. Says, I met Maggie Smith when I worked on her little mini car many years ago. Ah, cool. Don't suppose you had your camera with you at the time, did you? Okay, excellent. Right. So, what other kind of questions we got here? Becca and Jackie both wanted to know, I have a sense of tips. What do you do for the novice who's starting out doing portraiture? How do you kind of get into it? What a good starting point? I would say the first thing is photograph people you know. Photograph somebody that you've got a relationship with, that's already relaxed with you, that's already trusts you, that you're not happy, and is also forgiving. Because if you're new to portraiture, you're going to be fumbling around a lot, you're going to be making a lot of mistakes. And I suppose this is probably why a lot of people get into things like landscape photography first, is because there's nobody else to criticize you. If you muck up the landscape photo, the landscape doesn't turn around and say, oh, for God's sake, what have you done now? Or how dare you make me look, how dare you light me like this and, take this photo of me in a terrible light. You don't have to worry about anybody else's feelings. So portraiture, the best thing to do is start with people you know. And if you've got kids under the age, before puberty, generally speaking, kids tend to be up for it. They tend to be a lot less self-conscious. They're open to play. They're open to fun. So if you've got kids, or you've got nephews or nieces, or you've got a neighbour who's quite happy to lend you their kids, start there. That's a good point. If you've got a mate who is slightly less self-conscious, who's prepared to help you out, start there. So friends and family, that's where you start, and that's where you practice. That photo I did of Mark with the moody shadowing, I was able to do that because Mark's a friend. So that having somebody to practice on is really where you start. And then it's really about your social skills. Chances are, if you're wanting to have a go at portraiture, you've probably got a certain level of social skills as well, but you need to practice them. You need to sharpen them up. And that, again, will come through practice. And then it's about lighting. Play with the lighting as well. Try shadows from different angles and different kinds of lighting and what have you. And that because the lighting is what makes it interesting as well. And play with different expressions. I think the big thing for portraiture, the way portraiture just leaps forward in terms of interestingness, is get rid of the smile. What kind of photos could you take if the person in front of you isn't smiling, doesn't have to smile, in fact is even told not to smile? I mean, sometimes you can do that to make somebody start laughing, but that's a different kind of thing. If you're doing narrative photography, if you're trying to get something more interesting, once you remove the smile, you have thousands of other kinds of expressions that you can play with. So I would say pursue the non-smile. Try all the other thousands of possibilities and emotions and nuances and expressions that you could have that don't involve a smile. And I think that then becomes really, really interesting. I think that's the kind of thing that's likely to hook you into portraiture. Now, if you're doing portraiture for other people and they want a smiley photo of them, I mean, I do quite a lot of staff photography for businesses, and the whole point of the staff photo that's going on the website is that they got to make sure they look like they're warm and friendly, so that anybody who's never met them but has gone to their website thinks these are nice people to deal with. So for that, you then need to kind of learn how to coax warm and genuine smiles out of people rather than the forced grimace. That's a whole nother set of skills that you have. But I think portraiture, that isn't just about creating a warm smiley face for a staff portrait. If you're kind of getting into interesting faces, then yeah, the biggest tip is don't get rid of the smile and work with somebody who already is relaxed and trusts you, or is forgiving of you as well. So I hope that one helps. Okay, let's see what other kind of questions we've got coming up. Okay, Jackie is asking about lighting. Lighting is also a nightmare for most. What would your starting tips be besides practice as well as you can under every possible scenario with equipment you've got? Well, I would say, first of all, keep watching these podcasts. Put in your questions into these podcasts. And because lighting is a huge subject, and bit by bit we deal with it, and we deal with it under different circumstances. And if you've got a particular problem, stick your photo into the critique section of Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Let me know where your problem is. Let me know where your problem was with the lighting, or show me your picture and tell me where you got stuck. Maybe you didn't know what to do with the lighting. You're looking for suggestions. We can do it that way. Because basically the thing with lighting is it's multiple and complex. You can start off with one light, and then you can have one light plus reflected light. You can have two lights, you can have three lights, you can have multiple lights, you can have coloured gels, you can have reflections, bouncing light. So there's lots of different numbers of light sources. There's understanding as well. Probably one of the biggest tips to understand about lighting, I would say, is to grasp at the beginning, is the notion of the difference between hard shadows and soft shadows. And these differences are created by the size of the light source. Basically, a small light source creates a hard shadow. So if you think about the fact that when you're out in direct sunlight, you glance down at your shadow's got a very, very hard edge to it. And that's because the light source, the sun, whilst the sun may be 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, it's also 93 million miles away. So it's tiny. It's as small as the tip of your little finger held at arm's length. That's how small the sun is. If you hold it up, you can blot out the sun with your arm at arm's length by the fingernail on your little finger. And so it's a very small light source. It creates a very hard shadow. Similarly, flashes on on the camera, whether it's that little pop-up, or on your phone, things like that. These are small, and so they create hard shadows. Now, if you create a larger light source, so say you've got a large window without direct sunlight coming in, just a general window, a larger light source creates a softer shadow, and it can be quite a beautiful creamy shadow. And then a very large light source, if you consider the idea of if you go out on a cloudy day, the sun has hit the clouds and then spread right across. So it's like the clouds are acting as a massive diffuser, and the whole sky becomes your light source. And it's so big that the light is kind of coming from you evenly from all directions, and you have virtually no shadow. There may be sort of slightly darker patches underneath a car or underneath a table, but for the person standing there, if you're photographing a face, it doesn't matter which direction they look in, there's virtually no shadow on them. So that makes a profound difference to the quality of the photo, is the size of the light source. Understand that, and that's a real stepping stone into light. Then it's about understanding the angles at which light is coming from. And over different podcasts, I've talked about, and I will talk about again, the difference, say, between front lighting, side lighting, edge lighting, back lighting. reflected light. All these things can make a profound difference to the mood and the feel of whatever it is you're photographing, because it's not just about the light, it's also about shadow. And if you can understand shadow, you'll understand light. The two, if you can understand that, because sometimes people get fixated on light without really understanding shadow. But really, I tend to feel if you understand shadow, you have to understand light. But it's bigger, it's more encompassing. So I'm afraid, you're never going to get all that. This is weeks, months, years of learning condensed down into a couple of minutes. But as a starting point, I would say understanding light, try different angles, but mostly understand, first of all, that notion of shadow, and the quality of the shadow, whether it's a hard shadow or a soft shadow, is dependent on the size of the light source. Play with that and your knowledge of lighting will take a significant leap forward. So I hope that helps, Jackie. Okay, so Jackie's saying thanks, and Becca's saying thanks as well. That's great. Next up then, a few more questions. So what else have we got here? We had the relaxing people in front of the camera, who I'd love to photograph. Oh, here's one. How do you manage a team of people, especially if everyone has different agendas? Ooh, wow. Yeah, that's a biggie. So some of you will have seen some of the photos I've done before now. Okay, an example of this then. We've not actually done an awful lot in the way of visuals. It's mostly just been me talking. But if we go to something like this, 7 Deadly Sins of Chocolate shoot I did for In-House Chocolates. So basically we had a team of about 15 people on this shoot. And we've got 7 models. We've got hairdresser, we've got makeup artist, we've got stylist, and of course we've got the chocolatier, as well as me, the photographer, and somebody videoing it for creating a behind-the-scenes video of the shoot as well. So you've got this kind of thing going on. So you are managing a team of people, and not everybody in there is there for exactly the same reason. And especially when you're starting out with your photography, you don't get to nobody's going to commission you to take photos like this and pay you if you don't have a track record of being able to create big fancy photos. So the first sets of big fancy photos you create with your friends, you create with colleagues, you create with other people where nobody's getting paid. And so this then creates collaboration. So you collaborate. So, if I wanted a hairdresser, if I wanted a makeup artist, if I wanted a stylist, and none of these people were being paid, I had to convince them to come on board to say that it's going to be worth it because they would get copies of the photos and be able to show off the photos as part of their portfolio. So if you're a model, you might be an amazing model, but if you've only ever had bad photos taken of you, you're never going to be able to sell yourself very well as a model. You might be an amazing makeup artist, but if the only pictures you've got of the makeup are quick snaps that you've taken on your phone, they're not showing off your skills very well. Likewise, if you're a hairdresser. So the idea then is that you're going to create an interesting photo. You're going to pull together your team of people. But what's important here is that there's a photo for the client. There's the ultimate photo that, for the client, the person you're creating it for. Or if that's for yourself and you're the client, there's still that. There's the photo that you're chasing, the kind of photo you want. But you also have to take into consideration all these other agendas. So very often what happens is I'll take the photos that I want, but I will also take photos that are specifically designed to show off the hair. Here's hair photos. Here's makeup photos. Here's photos which show the models in a good light. Here's photos which are slightly more fashion-like, showing the clothes or the stylist or whatever. So whoever else is involved, you take them into consideration. What you are doing is you are bartering. You are bartering your skills for their skills. And barter isn't a one-way process, it's a two-way process. They have to feel that they've had at least as much in payment for their skills as they've given you. And as long as you understand that from the beginning, everything will pretty much go okay. Or is much more likely to go okay. And it's about clarity from the start. What do people want? I mean, I do remember once there was a photo shoot where a model came on board, but they were brought on board by, I think it was a hairdresser, and they'd had a conversation. Now, I didn't really know the model so well, and I thought I was just providing her with a few photos, a couple of photos, and then I remember there was a bit of a fallout afterwards because she expected more photos or other things or different kinds of photos to show off her modelling skills, and she'd been assured that she would have these for giving up her time. I hadn't been included in that conversation. I'd assumed that the model was being dealt with by the hairdresser. The hairdresser had just said, oh yeah, Kim will do what you need, etc., etc. And so that was one of those I learned the hard way. That really it's worth having the conversations with everybody or being clear at the beginning. Whenever I start a photo shoot, if I've got a team of people, we always have the meeting beforehand so that everybody knows what we're aiming to do. So everybody's on board. We create the common vision so everybody knows exactly what it is we're going to be creating. I can get input from each people because a lot of these people have some really creative ideas and an eye for things, and will see things that maybe I've missed or come up with other really more interesting ideas than I might have come up with myself. And that's great. But I also need to make it clear to them that they need to let me know if they don't feel like getting what they need, or to let me know what it is they do need in order to feel satisfied. So it's communication again. Collaboration is all about communication. And as long as you do that, you're much more likely to be able to get where you need to. So I hope that helps. Right, how else are we doing here? Okay, well, coming up towards 9 o'clock here, I think I'll just answer one or two more questions before we draw it to a close. If you have any questions that you don't feel are answered, that you would love to know the answer to, drop them into the comments just now. And then after that, I will tell you what we're up to next week. Actually, I'll tell you what we're up to next week now, and then I'll answer a last question or two. So this podcast, for anybody who's watching this, who's come essentially via Spring Fling, this isn't a typical podcast. I mean, typical as in it's live and you can see me and this is the usual setup. Most podcasts I do where the first section I talk about a technique or a photo shoot. The second section is critique. And this is the chance for you to send in your images, let me know where your sticking point is, and I will do my best to help you through critique and feedback to get past your sticking point and improve your photography. And you can come back week after week putting new photos in with new questions, and that's fine. There's no problem with that. That's what this whole thing is about. And to do that, there's a Facebook group called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Go join the Facebook group and then post your images. Roughly once every 4 or 5 weeks or so, I also do a challenge where we take some kind of topic. Previous topics have been things like self-portraiture, minimalism, product photography. Was there product photography? No, still life. That was it, still life. So we set a challenge, and at that point people will send in their photos and we all kind of look for ways of inspiring each other. And usually the week before the challenge, when I set the challenge, I talk about what the challenge is going to be. And that's what we're going to be doing next week. So next week, I'm going to be setting a challenge for the week after. And next week, what I'm going to be talking about is silhouettes. So a bit like shadows, but not quite. Shadows get cast onto something else. Silhouettes are of the thing themselves, except you're only seeing the outline of them. And how you do that, what you do with that, and how do you create a story, a mood, an impression, an expression, when you can't see any of the detail, is quite an interesting thing. And then how much the background makes a difference when you can't see the detail of the actual subject itself. So I think there's a whole world to explore with silhouettes. So next week, the first part of the podcast, I'm going to be talking about silhouettes. Then what I'm going to do is move on to the critique section, and that will be on any topic. It's not just silhouettes, it can be anything you like, any sticking points that you have. Take your photos and put them into the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook group. And I will do my best to give you feedback. And then in 2 weeks' time, that will be the silhouette challenge, where you can stick your own photos in. After next week, when I've talked about silhouettes, hopefully it will give you enough ideas, whet your appetite, make you excited enough to work out how to do your own silhouette photos. Okay, so that's what we're going to be dealing with next week. So let's get on to, what have we got here? Okay, somebody's asked, what genre do you find the hardest? I'm kind of talking about, I suppose, really I talked about ones that I suppose my hardest are the ones that I feel where you've got to be really patient. So essentially wildlife photography and street photography are ones where that notion of waiting for the right set of circumstances, these are the ones, and they're hardest because they're the ones that I don't practice as much. I don't practice it, so it becomes a feedback loop. I don't practice them, so I find them harder to do. I'm really good now at doing portraits because I've done them a lot, and I did them a lot because I got excited by them. So there is a feedback loop that goes on with that. Taking photos. Which do you prefer, taking photos or teaching photography? Do I prefer taking the photos or doing the podcasts? It's both. I don't really, and it's not just the podcast. The reality is, if you're in portraits, if you come to me and you get your photo taken by me, you end up getting a photography tutorial at the same time, because I don't just take photos of people. Because I'm doing the tethering, I'm explaining what's going on. I teach people photography as I'm photographing them. I teach them about light, I teach them about expressions, I teach them about portraiture and how the camera is interacting with them. And I love that side of it. I absolutely love that side of it. You learn so much more by teaching as well. There is one of these expressions which, if you ever want to really learn something, teach somebody else. Because a lot of the times we have the idea, we think we know something, and we've got it all sort of loosely sloshing around in our heads. But the minute somebody says, "Oh, and how do you do that?" and you've now got to go from, "Well, I thought it was obvious and I know what I'm doing," and you now have to explain it to somebody who doesn't know. And in order to do that, you have to rearrange your thoughts. You have to organise your thoughts in such a way to make it clear. And to do that, very often you end up making it clearer to yourself as well. The number of times I've found clarity. Also, there's a lot of fun as well with the fact that people will ask me questions. For example, the still life challenge, I seem to remember, came out of somebody saying specifically, "I'm wanting to do more still life. Can you give us some tips and tricks?" And I thought, okay, that'll be fine. And I thought I knew what I was doing until I actually really got round to trying to study still life. And I went and looked up what the Dutch old masters were doing of still life with their paintings several centuries ago. And I learned a huge amount from researching, and then from when I actually came to creating the photo, all the little things that I had to do with the lighting and the layout and then the editing. So teaching teaches me as well. And I love the fact that other people then feel good about having learned something as well. So the teaching really is a part of it. But of course, the teaching itself isn't enough on its own. I couldn't teach if I didn't actually go out and take the photos as well. And I love doing the photos, and I specifically love doing the portraiture. So I think that's brought us up to 9 o'clock. I've been chatting away now solidly for an hour and a half. Doesn't look like there's any more questions in the comments. So thank you so much for everybody who sent in the images. Thank you for, the questions rather. Thank you to everybody who's commented. Let me know you're here, kept the chat going. And I hope you found that interesting. Feedback is always wonderful, so do let me know whether you felt this was interesting or not. And next week, make sure you tune in next week for where I'm going to talk about the silhouettes, but also stick in your images. Anything you're having problems with, if you want to advance your photography, stick in your images, stick in your questions as well. If you've got questions that haven't been answered tonight, or things about photography you really want to know, things about specific photos you want to know, then ask away. Kazia says, thank you, Kim. And so that's pretty much it. I hope you found this interesting. Tell your friends, bring them along, and hopefully I'll see you all next Tuesday. Take care. Thank you very much. Good night.